Alright guys, so in this video I just wanted to discuss the warning signs, the final warning signs when it comes to the collapse of the Twin Towers, specifically focusing on the South Tower and specifically talking about hypotheticals when it comes to what was happening inside of the South and also the North Towers before the collapse but after the planes got hit. One of the biggest mysteries to me would be, obviously both of the towers get hit. Could there potentially be any plane parts inside? Like let's say you're on a few floors above of the impact zone and you're looking, it's like, what do you see? Do you see a giant hole? Do you see a bunch of debris? Could there be possibly a tire that would be remaining? Now, I've researched this and I've looked up some answers to what actually happened to the planes. The idea is based on how fast they were traveling, colliding directly with the tower. Basically, the planes would be indistinguishable outside of possibly some of the wheels. But if you're looking down, like let's say you're 3 or 4 floors above the impact zone, in either the South or North Tower, you're probably just seeing a bunch of debris, a bunch of fire, a bunch of smoke. There is some photographs of people in the impact zone actually looking out. It's just crazy to think about, like, what do you think they saw? Did they see any plane pieces, plane parts? That's always been a crazy hypothetical to me. When it comes to the South Tower, they knew, a lot of the internal people knew pretty much right away that the South Tower would collapse based on where it was hit. A lot of architects knew it was in deep trouble. They also thought the North Tower possibly could have survived based on where it was hit directly square on, but there were calls coming from people inside of the South Tower that were above the impact zone. They were calling 911 saying the floors below are collapsing. So apparently within the South Tower, in between the plane hitting it and it collapsing, there were floors above the impact zone that were collapsing one by one, and then obviously the building, it didn't last long based on it being hit on its side, the fact that it was lower. Those calls were coming at around 9:37 a.m. It was an occupant on the 105th floor reporting that floors beneath him in the 90-something floor had collapsed on top of each other. So the building itself was collapsing on the interior before the entire thing actually collapsed. That's something that I'm sure, a lot of people don't know about. It is crazy to think about. Now, there were 3 main stairwells in both the North and the South Tower, and out of the 6 total within the 2 buildings, only 1 remained. It was located in the South Tower, and again, it had to do with where the plane hit. It hit at an off angle, meaning the stairwell A, where 18 people were able to escape, it stayed intact and you could actually get down that way, but it was not an easy thing, especially dealing with all of that smoke. I've also talked about the idea of possibly trying to get to the roof. It would be extremely hard considering, any type of passageway, any type of stairway going up to the roof would have just been a complete chimney, let alone the fact that the roof was not open. It was locked anyways. And then another thing I wanted to focus on was the damage that the North Tower sustained after the South Tower fell, because there's no real assessment we can do considering there was such a short window in between the South Tower falling and the North Tower falling. There is the hypothetical, what if the South Tower fell but the North Tower stayed up? Would we repair it? Would it be okay? I think that it would be some type of controlled demolition, but yes, the North Tower suffered significant damage, and there are a few photos that I've shared in previous videos of the Trident windows, the lobby windows being blown out because of the collapse of the South Tower. Also, you had all of the lobby just completely coated in dust and debris. There's photos where it's like 2 feet of debris going up the lobby windows, and you can't even see inside of the North Tower because it's just coated in dust and rubble and soot from a giant building right next to it collapsing and spreading all over the place. It is a crazy thing to think about. Also, you also have to account for the Marriott, which got completely split in half, but it was still technically standing. It was just broken in half because the South Tower fell directly in the middle of it, and then the North Tower completely finished it off outside of one little crevice, one little side area that did survive the Marriott. But technically the Marriott, it would have been completely destroyed anyways, even if the North Tower stayed up, because it was completely split in half. But there were rooms that were still, at least it looked like from photos, still in operation after the South Tower collapsed. And what I mean by in operation is, they were still together. Obviously, nobody would want to be in those things. But when it comes to the South Tower's collapsed, it did shatter windows and damage other exterior elements along the North Tower's southern and eastern facades. Although this damage itself was insufficient in causing the final collapse of the North Tower, after the South Tower fell, NYPD helicopters relayed the information about the deteriorating conditions of the North Tower, while FDNY commanders issued orders for firefighters in the North Tower to evacuate. Poor radio reception meant that firefighters inside the North Tower did not hear the evacuation order from their supervisors, and that goes back to the whole idea of just the entire thing was a complete mess. So many people were calling 911. They were getting so many different commands. You would think when the South Tower collapsed, obviously you want to get all of the firefighters out of the North Tower, but there was just so much going on at the time. It was very hard to communicate and get word in terms of that, but they did hear inside of the North. Obviously, you could hear the South Tower collapsing. That would just be a crazy, very brutal thing to see, especially if you're somebody in the North Tower looking outside of the window, trying to get some air because your entire room is filled with smoke, and you see the South Tower collapse. That is literally, it's just a horrible, horrible image, but that's what happened. And then at approximately 10:27 a.m., an aviation unit declared that the roof was going to come down very shortly in regards to the North Tower, basically saying at 10:27 a.m. the building was going to collapse. And it proved to be correct, as less than a minute later at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed. So the aviation unit came out and said, look, the South Tower's already gone, the North Tower is going. I wonder what the aviation unit saw when it came to the building and the stability of it to say at 10:27 that it's coming down, and then at 10:28 it actually collapses. That's something interesting. But in general, obviously, after the South Tower collapsed, you can kind of draw conclusions that even though the North Tower was hit in a more favorable way, being hit head-on higher up, it still very likely would have come down just based off of the internal fires, all of the damage, and the weakening structure. Again, it's not about melting the beams, because that's what people will say. It's about weakening the structure's integrity. That's exactly what happened. If you look at zoomed-in photos of the South Tower in its initial second where it's collapsing, you can see the wall kind of inverting and bending inward. That tells you the structure's integrity has completely failed, and the building is collapsing on top of itself, and it falls at an angle, at least the South Tower did, based on where it was hit. But either way, guys, that is just what was going on in both of the towers. I think one of the things that people need to remember and understand, just the sheer amount of smoke. Whatever, like if you envision a bunch of smoke, times that by 10, and that's what was going on inside these buildings. It was just so much smoke. Like, we'll never be able to wrap our heads around how much smoke was actually inside of those rooms and the surrounding areas. And you can see it in the windows, billowing out of the windows and stuff, but until you experience something like that, there's no way we can really understand just how crazy and catastrophic the smoke really was. And there's just no escaping it. There really wasn't, especially obviously on the upper floors, the entire upper areas below the impact zone. It was just a complete chimney. The entire building was a chimney. They say the elevators were chimneys because just in general, smoke rises. The entire building just contains so much smoke above the impact zone. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.